Here, I got it. Wonderful. So we are now recording. So I will pass it over to you, Dr. Soderstrom.
All right. Thank you, Anthony, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out for this new idea that the Advancement Office is doing. It's sort of an initiative, I think, in the university, the larger university, to connect the faculty, the staff, the students with alums, not just alums, but with the board of directors and trustees and all of that. So it's a good outreach work that we're doing. Uh, so yeah, like Anthony said, I've been teaching here for about, I don't know, I guess 16 years or so. I'm sitting right now in Caroline Hall. So if you remember Caroline Hall, I'm not sure what it Caroline Hall was when you were here. I know I was a dorm at one point. I know my father, Mel Soderstrom, had a financial aid office or development office here in Caroline Hall, but now it's all mostly faculty offices in the humanities. Um, so yeah, what we're going to be doing today, and I guess I'm the first one doing these talks, so there isn't really a template for how it'll work. But this is a sort of modified presentation that I gave to the faculty this fall on the philosophy of work and thinking with our faculty and staff about how a philosopher, which is what I do, I guess, as a profession, would think about questions of work and meaningful work and the justice of work, whether it relates to an individual's sense of meaning and purpose, or even questions about the economy and how different people work within an economy. So there's a lot of topics that we can talk about here. I think how I'm going to do this is I'm going to share my screen with some slides on it. Um, and in some ways, it'll probably feel a little bit like how I might run a classroom. So I'm going to present some ideas, ask some questions. Certainly, we'll have time to discuss at the end, but there'll also be a couple moments in the middle where you'd be happy to pipe in here. And maybe one thing in particular, I saw that Caleb Nyquist is on the call, and Caleb was a student of mine years ago, and I know that one of his passions is environmental justice and addressing the needs of people in light of climate change and all of that. And some of my work in this area is related to that. I wrote a chapter for a book that was edited by my North Park philosophy professor, Steve Buma-Prediger, who now teaches at Hope College. Um, and it was all on different ways that we might think about engaging environmental ethics in that. So this is sort of like, you could say, a partially ecologically informed philosophy of work. So, anyways, I'm going to just get into a few things that I want to say. So, I'm going to share my screen here. Um, so, uh, if this is working, I'm sorry, if it's not working, if somebody could let me know. But it looks like on my end that this is going through. Excellent. Okay. So, all right, so we have an image here. I'm going to be showing a number of artworks because engage in the arts and especially visual arts is something that I do as a philosopher. It helps sometimes connect more abstract ideas to what people are experiencing and thinking about. So I don't want to go too much into this photograph here. This is a sort of famous photograph by a renowned photographer, Sebastian Salgado from 1986. And this is, the kind of thing that you could look up afterwards or something like that, his work. Um, but in particular, the photo essay that he came up with that's depicted here is from the Serra Pelada gold mine in Brazil. And it's a fascinating historical event that happened in this gold rush in the middle of Brazil, where a nugget of gold was found in the ground. Um, and word got out that there was gold in the hills, and this over several years started digging out this mine. It was never owned by anybody in particular. It was this chaotic and cooperative and almost kind of free for all of people digging into the ground. And And Salgado does a reflection on this in an interesting documentary, but he says, seeing people strive for gold, toil for gold, bring about human society out of chaos, he says is sort of a window into humanity and a window into why people work. Anyways, just something you might check out. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit as a philosopher. So we can think about philosophy of work in two ways, right? So when I applied for my job here at North Park, I had to give a statement on my philosophy of teaching, in some sense, a philosophy of my own vocation. Um, and certainly that's related to what the philosophy of work is. But in another way, the philosophy of work is thinking about these three sort of basic topics that I have listed here. What qualifies for work as an experience or a concept within a culture? What are the criteria for meaningful or ethical work? And by extension, unethical work or work without meaning? And then finally, how do work practices of an individual or a society reflect or conflict with other moral values? Okay. So I have an image here, a painting titled Leisure and Labor. And in some ways, there's a lot that is communicated just in this image, right? We have primarily two individuals. There's also a third individual in the background you can't quite see. Two individuals engaged in two very different kinds of human activity, right? Presumably, the person on the right, standing quite at his leisure, relaxed, well-dressed, clean, ready to presumably go out horseback riding, right? And then we have the laborer there, stooped over, straining, trying to, I'm guessing, put a horseshoe onto this horse, right? And we can think about like these two different kinds of activities that make us human, that we engage in, right? Labor and leisure, right? Presumably, they're opposites. We often talk about things like the work-life balance, um, that a work that is, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. But a life simply of leisure would have its own kinds of, its unique kind of poverty if there wasn't any work involved in it at all. Okay, so we're going to think about some of these topics that are brought up here. Something that thinking about why people work, how people work, what is good work or meaningful work, or what is unjust in our economies, right? That reveals a few other things. It reveals things about what does it mean to be human. It reveals things about the purposes of social organization. How do people cooperate? What is the purposes of an economy? If we say that we live in a capitalist economy, why or how does that capitalist economy celebrate certain kinds of work? How does it not celebrate other kinds of work? Thinking about this topic will also reveal something about our relationship to the natural world, right? So is the world there simply for us to alter and change and manipulate and sort of get whatever natural resources we can out of it? Or are there other kinds of relationships we want to the natural world? And lastly, it reveals something about our religious beliefs. So, at least for myself in the Christian tradition, right, there's a rich notion of vocation, right, that we are called by God to do certain kinds of work, or we're called to have a certain attitude towards work or commitment to work, right? So, these are all the kind of big picture philosophical questions that one might think about. All right. One place to start when you're starting to think, at least in my profession, about a new idea or a concept or a phenomenon is to ask, like, what do we know already, right? What is in our imagination? When we think about the nature of work, how do we imagine it? Imagine it? How do each of you imagine it? Um, and something that, is interesting, and this could be a whole discussion and topic in itself with alumni, is this question of how did you imagine work before college and now after being in your career, right? All of us grew up with a certain kind of informed imagination about what our work life might be like, right? We're asked when we're little kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up, right? And even more so, it seems, I have a couple now adult kids. it seems that there's even more of this focus on career preparedness among young people, right? In an earlier age, right? The purpose of grammar school is to get into a good high school. The purpose of high school is to get into a college. The purpose of college is to get into a good career, right? There's this kind of, you know, conveyor belt that we get on early, okay? But there is this question of like, what informs how we think about work? And one quick thing here, I should just note, I can't quite see the chat. I'll be able to check in with the chat in just a minute here, but if you're typing things in the chat, um, I'll certainly get back to them, but I might not see them during this first part of the presentation. Um, okay, so one of the ways that I started thinking about this years ago was I went to an art exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And they had an art exhibit there called The Sweat of Their Face, portraying the American worker. And I did this to see how have artists portrayed what does it mean to work, right? So we have a picture, a very sort of Norman Rockwell kind of picture, kind of nostalgic, kind of joyful picture of a coal miner. Now, I don't know if we have any alumni that are coal miners or come from coal mining families, right? And maybe there are some days of being a coal miner when this is the look on your face, maybe before the shift, maybe less so after the shift. But nevertheless, this image informs something about how we think about work, right? The joyful worker, the satisfied worker, right? Even something as difficult, strenuous as coal mining, right? There's still this kind of image that is being presented here. Okay, a few other art objects in the gallery are these three pieces here, right? And I'm not going to pick these apart. I do teach a philosophy of art class, but we won't go into that right now. But we might say a few things, right? So this first one on the left, we have The Mechanic at a Steam Pump by Lewis Hines, 1921, right? You could think about what does this convey about the relationship between human beings and their jobs, right? There's a kind of symmetry, there's a kind of beauty that is presented here. There's this kind of way that human beings fit themselves to machines, and perhaps machines fit themselves to human beings, right? There's a kind of harmonious activity going on there. The second one by Gordon Parks, showing Ella Watson, right? This is a charwoman. You maybe not know what a charwoman is. A charwoman is like a temp. It's like a temporary cleaning person, right? This isn't necessarily even something she regularly does, right? So here's a temp worker in Washington, D.C., presumably at one of, the major important government buildings there, right? And that conveys something else, a kind of mix of dignity and humility, or tiredness and something inspiring, right? All this kind of conflict that is going on here. And lastly, we have a recent one by Josh Klein that is titled 9 to 5, and we could interpret that in terms of maybe things like the disconnected nature of some of our jobs. Okay, all of this is just simply to get us thinking about how do we imagine work. One last thing I'll say about how I sort of wanted to start thinking about this is I did a project during a sabbatical where I interviewed people up and down Clark Street about the nature of their jobs. And I took a sort of photo essay of that. And it was a way to get me outside of the academy, outside of just working with college students, and to hear how other Chicagoans do their work, are frustrated by their work, find meaning in their work. And so that was an important part of me thinking through this as well. And, I could say, sometimes when you have conversations with people, sometimes it can seem like small talk to ask people, well, what do you do for a living? It seems like such an easy conversation point. But it's also something really meaningful. I mean, we spend a lot of time doing things with regard to work, and it's part of our identities. And we'll get into a little bit of what that can mean. Okay, so let's think together. And this is where if you want to pipe in and unmute for a second and just offer up some quick responses, this could be a time to do it. So, if we're thinking about what is work, right? Sometimes it's helpful to begin with a definition. Philosophy sometimes begins with definitions and then picks them apart. Other times it just begins with experiences and tries to build up to a definition. Okay, but a problem comes up when you're trying to define something, in particular, something as complex as our work lives, right? And that would be, does the word work mean anything consistent? There are so many different jobs that we have. There are so many different kinds of activities that we have that might entail working or labor or exertion. Um, is there any way to define it? Now, this is not just an academic question. How you define what work is and what labor is a very significant policy question, right? It has to do with how you structure economies. What kinds of work do you want to compensate? How should you compensate in certain kinds of work, right? So the definition, sure, is a sort of big philosophical question, but it certainly plays out in how we organize our societies, how within an organization, within your workplace, or your company, or who gets unemployment benefits, right? What kinds of work should be paid what? Okay, so one way to start this, and this is where I'd be curious to hear a couple responses from people if you want to offer something up. One way to think about this is there some criteria that makes all of these activities work? And I list, I don't know, 8 different activities here. A third century farmer, an 8th century nun, a 15th century artist, an 18th century slave, a 19th century midwife, a 20th century corporate executive, or a 21st century Uber driver. And I'd be curious on, can you name something that is common to all of these activities that seem to explain why they should be considered work? And maybe you want to say some aren't, but any suggestions? If you'd rather just type it in the chat, I can see the chat now as well. So, is there something that connects them all, that make them all work and maybe not something else? So some of you are contributing answers in the chat. One is purposeful towards a goal. All of these have some purpose, some goal. Concentration and effort. Anything else come to mind? Right? If you say concentration and effort, presumably you're saying just effort in itself, strenuous effort in itself that involves no concentration or attention or intention, right? Isn't exactly work. It's just, I don't know what it is. It's just effort.
Providing a service?
Providing a service, okay? Right? Which might assume that there's a need. I guess some people offer services even when there isn't a need. Um, but right, Bob Dylan's on my mind when he says everybody's got to serve somebody. Um, a way to make a living. Okay. The director of the general education program here says that that's what North Park education prepares you for, how to make a life and make a living. And maybe those are two different things. Maybe they come together for some of us. Okay, so just want to make sure I can see what I'm showing you. Okay. All right. can somebody just confirm something here so I make sure that we're looking at the same thing? Are you seeing the full slide about unpaid labor and what is not work?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So, an important question, of course, is right. It's very easy to think work is generally something you're paid for, something that you're recognized for, right? That you're compensated for it in some way, right? And, when I brought up this discussion with the faculty, there was an objection and even a sort of offense that I included a slave in the same list as all these other things, right? Um, because to them, work in necessarily, if it was to be human, if it was at all dignifying, right? So Martin Luther King says all work has dignity, right? And there's a sense in which that's true, but forced labor seems to run in the face of that. Okay. On top of that, you could also think about unpaid work, raising children, caring for one's parents, tending to the household garden, all these things, right? Um, Usually we think society shouldn't pay parents to raise their children, right? That's part of sort of the social contract is what it means to be a parent is I don't need to be paid. I might get a tax benefit so that maybe some of the expenses are eased. But there is a question in philosophy and ethics on what should we pay our citizens to do. Okay. I want to think about as sort of I finish some of what I'm going to be talking about. I want to think about three fundamental practices, right? So what I've introduced is ways that we imagine work, right? Our culture gives us ways that we imagine it. The problem of trying to come up with a definition, right? And I'm going to propose that I can't say that all work comes down to these three practices, but I think it's helpful to think of these three fundamental practices: toil, production, and reproduction. Okay, so the first is toil. And this is where I might say that how we think about work always connects to a particular aspect of the environment, whether it's the natural environment or our cultural environment. Okay, first is let's think of ways that we might think about toil. And toil isn't all negative here, but here's one way to think about it, right? The natural world is ordered and it's stubborn, right? It takes work to sustain our life in it, right? If you know the Genesis story, right, one of the curses after the fall for Adam was that the ground was going to be difficult to work. Presumably in the Garden of Eden, there was plenty to go around. It didn't take much toil, but after the fall, right? But you could just say the natural environment takes effort to get nutrients from it, right? Toil has something to do with necessity. It distinguishes, I think, work from other things like play or worship. Um, there's a need that we have to do certain kinds of work. Russell Buerhead writes, if not for all, then for most, work is a command, not an option. We do it because we have to do it, because we are born and remain insufficient. Okay, so the world is ordered, the environment is ordered, it is stubborn, we need to exert in order to get anything out of it. This is one aspect of toil that haunted 20th century philosophy. Toil corresponds to the processes of the body and its vital, a metabolism we share with all living organisms. Since our life process, though it leads us from birth to death in a linear manner, is itself circular, the laboring activity must follow the cycle of life, the circular movement of our bodily functions, which means that the laboring activity never comes to an end as long as life lasts, right? So one aspect of toil is that it's repetitive, it's cyclical. In a very basic sense, making food every day, having to make food every day. It's endless. It's just part of what it means to be alive. It's a repetitive exertion upon the world in order to just sustain us to the next day, right? Plenty of jobs have this kind of repetitiveness, right? Maintaining the books, if you're an accountant, right? You're not doing any, necessarily in that moment anything creative, but the operation of your business, of your organization, of your community sometimes just take this sort of repetitive kind of work. Nevertheless, Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes, says, I know that there is nothing better for humanity than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. It is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in their toil, right? This isn't necessarily meaningful vocation. This is just toil. There's a pleasure to it. Hannah Arendt says, laboring is the only way we can swing contentedly in nature's prescribed cycle, toiling and resting, laboring and consuming with the same happy and purposeless regularity with which day and night, life and death follow each other. There can be a kind of joy that you can experience in your repetitive, meditative tasks. Okay, the second main kind of work is productive work or creative work, right? The natural world is not just ordered and stubborn, it's malleable, so we can change it. The work of our hands, as distinguished from the labor of our bodies, fabricates the sheer, unending variety of things whose sum total constitutes the human artifice, the world we live in, right? Human beings make their world, they create their world, they change the natural environment in order to build things, to make works of art, right? To set up an organization, right? To build a neighborhood, to do simple things like manufacture a piece of furniture, right? Our productive work gives a changeable world stability. It gives our cultures, which change over time, a stability and enduring value. If you have made something in your life that lasts beyond one day, you have created something in this kind of sense of things, right? And I'll just go back to the accountant. Certain aspects of being an accountant are just maintaining the books. That's a kind of toil. But certain aspects of being an accountant are designing new systems by which your company might organize its finances or its budget, right? That endures, that sets up a set of practices that organizes your life together, right? A book I'd recommend for anybody is called Shop Class is Soulcraft. One of the aspects of productive work, creative work, is captured in the idea of a craftsman, right? Directly or metaphorically. Crawford writes, craftsmanship poses a challenge to consumerism. The craftsman is proud of what they have made, while the consumer discards things that are perfectly serviceable in his restless pursuit of the new. Being able to think materially about material goods, hence critically, gives some independence from the manipulations of marketing, right? Crawford in this book writes a lot about the trades and the importance of the trades, being a plumber, an electrician, a carpenter, or that, and how much the trades should be valued. And one of the ways they can be valued is by cultivating in us the idea of a craftsperson, right? That we take an excellence or a skill and we design or build a world around it. Okay, the third and final kind of work. One is toil, repetitive, endless, simplistic in a way. One is productive, which is changing the world that you live in, right? The last one here is reproductive work. This comes out of, in my profession or in the literature, it comes out of a feminist response to, you could say, 19th and 20th century capitalism. But that's the story. The idea is the natural world is adaptive, procreative, and mortal. It is dying and giving birth all the time, right? At least a healthy ecosystem is something that is creating itself in an ongoing way. Reproductive labor involves giving birth and cultivating new life. It's a work that cares for the fecundity or the creativity of the earth and its members. Reproductive labor renews, restores, and cares for life that is not primarily one's own, right? The most direct thing you might think of is raising children, of caring for somebody who is sick, restoring them to health, right? There are certain elements of that that can be like toil, but if you're doing it out of love for the sake of someone else, to participate in the sort of reproductive creativity of a community, it's a different kind of labor, right? So I have this great image here of two different kinds of work. I don't have the title of the painting here. I should have put it on there. Right? But one of them is people maybe engaged in a kind of exertion, moving a stone. They're building something, right? And then we have this worker who's taking a break to care for his child or be with his the mother of the child to care for them, right? There is a reason why we say we use the same term labor for giving birth as we do for economic work. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with a kind of summary of ideas, and then we can have a discussion. So here's the idea. To be human is to work. It's not only to work, but it is to work. We toil in the world, we make and change our worlds, and we care for those living in it, human and non-human. We are creaturely, we are creative, and we are procreative. So I think forms of work correspond to our relationship to the environment, natural environment, social environment within our organizations. Our natural and cultural environments are ordered and stubborn sometimes. They're malleable, they can be changed, and they're life-giving. They nourish us and inspire us, or they can anyways. Theologically, you might say the version of this would be to say we are finite creatures bound to creation. We are co-creators with God in creation. And we are here to share in and steward the procreative or the creative character of the world itself. And a final thesis would be, where is justice? If we think about how do we organize our work lives in our communities, in our families, in our companies or organizations, right? We have three kinds of work: toil, productive work, reproductive work, right? They're rarely, in the course of a day or a week, they're rarely experienced in isolation. Some jobs, though, can be defined only according to one or the other. I think I'd say that injustice happens when societies or organizations or even a family limits individuals or entire social classes to a single kind of work, right? There is a class of people who are there to simply toil for the rest of us. There is the creative class, and they are there simply to do creative work. And then there are those that care for others, right? We might have a calling in one of these or an emphasis in one of these, but I think it's a kind of injustice to say a human life should be defined by any one of these. So for personal reflection, you could examine in the course of your days or weeks' activities, when and with whom have you toiled in the repetitive maintenance of life for yourself, your organization, your family? When have you produced or created something new and enduring? And when have you cared for or restored someone other than yourself? So that's my set of reflections to get us thinking. I guess now is time. We have a little bit of time to have a conversation and discussion. You're muted, Anthony.
I am muted. I don't think I am.
No, you're not. Okay.
Okay. I want to invite people. We're not a huge group, so you can definitely come off mute to ask your questions, but also feel free to use the chat. So, uh, yeah, we turn it over to you for questions.
Or comments or anecdotes.
I will say that I toiled when I spent a summer at North Park stuffing admissions envelopes and stamping them, believe it or not.
How many hours a day would you do that?
I think I did this for honestly like 8 hours a day in the basement of Old Main.
Any other examples or memories? We've all done different kinds of work in our lives of one kind of moment of toil or a period of creative work. The
Well,
alumni office is always interested in hearing our stories of what happened after North Park. But go ahead.
when I was in high school, I picked strawberries, and that was certainly a toil and reminded me that I did not want to do that for the rest of my life.
Well, that's interesting that you should bring that up because that's how I paid for my clothes in high school was working for the canneries, picking strawberries. I've been reading lately Dr. Randy Woodley and Stephen Charleston in talking about how our Western worldview is not sustainable. For example, the mining industry or the way we are abusing natural resources that are not, that they will eventually go away. So I'm very concerned ecologically that the greed and the competition and it's not sustainable. Do you have any response to those ideas?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Are there others that have a thought or to Sally's question? Like the relationship between sustainability and kinds of work or consumption?
Mm-hmm.
There was a thinker, John Locke, uh, philosopher who, of course, was partially responsible for some of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. But he had some thoughts on work, and one of the things at his time he thought, because toil depends on the limits of the human body, right? The human body can only cultivate so many strawberries in an 8-hour workday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of his thought was there's a kind of natural limit to how much we can take out of the land because the human body has natural limits. And of course, what changes that and what changes not just the way people work, but right, is how productive technology adds to how much we can pull out of the land, right? And so, right, by turning over toil to very highly efficient machines, we take away some of that natural limit on how we relate to the environment. Of course, this doesn't mean that I think technology is bad, but at least that's the trade-off we made, right? So, anybody involved in work that just want to help us like imagine it that fits creative work, making something, or the work of care, and maybe I didn't spell it out in ways that you experience it. So I'm curious on some of the range of professions or kinds of works that people do in this group.
Well, if I could chime in for a moment. So actually, this also goes back to the question of toil. I had the great benefit in my life of being able to spend a year and a half as a live on site camp counselor for an intervarsity camp in Canada, um, and I would say when your work hours are from 6 a.m. to like 10 o'clock at night every single day, dealing with hundreds of kids. There are definitely times it is a toil. It is definitely a toil. And it's definitely a job of love and care. I mean, it can't really be anything else. Otherwise you're not in it for what that job is. And at the same time though, even though it is toil and it is hard work, it is some of the most uplifting, most joyous, most sort of fulfilling work that I've ever had the joy of doing. To the point that we've often, at least once in our lives, heard the phrase, you know, what is it? When you're doing what you're called to do, your work isn't work anymore, or something like that.
When you love what you do,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something, you don't have to
yeah, yeah.
worry.
Um, and it's wonderful. But going to the topic of sustainability, it does take a certain youthful sort of uh, approach, and as humans, there is a point at which, when I become old enough, I can't run around with kids all the time. I can't put in a 12 or 18-hour workday every day of the week. It's not possible. But at the same time, it is sustainable in the sense that hopefully I'm raising another generation of folks that can carry on such a wonderful line of work for these children. So yeah, there you go. Just
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, Kirk. That's a whole nother aspect of it is work in the course of one's life and what is the work that I can and want to do at this chapter of my life, which, and yeah, I think something like mentoring the younger generation is very much a kind of reproductive work. Um you're caring for the next generation, you're future oriented. Um, right. And, maybe some of that mentoring is, I mean, I've worked as a camp counselor too. I know what it's like to have your whole life from when you wake up to go to sleep in the same work environment. So maybe modeling how to take breaks, how to find leisure, how to get a better balance is something we can do.
I've been a stay-at-home parent for 8 years now, for and trying to figure out but I'm thinking today the way you broke it down into like the three categories of toil and creation and recreation, how I can speak from my experience, but if I also project onto all humans, I kind of feel like there's a balance that we all need. There are days when the act of like creating and I don't know which one parenting falls under, but like the emotional work of raising kids is so draining that to clean the bathroom, which is what I was actually doing during Westerveer presentation, is like relieving and gives my brain a break. And also the tedium of maintaining a house or whatever physical labor that comes every day gets broken up when I get to make a new dinner or like I just have seen in my own life how I need different, like the three kinds have balanced out for me in different ways so that I can do all of them because they're all needed at different times too.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, no, I think parenting, I think that's a great example of that. I mean, this is a simplistic way to put what you just articulated. But I mean, sometimes I think, well, okay, maybe like there's something productive about making the nursery room, right? You've created a new space, right? And then there's all the tedium and the toil. And again, like Arendt was saying, there's a certain kind of joy. Sometimes like you can't just have like creative and meaningful experiences. Sometimes just making a meal is its own kind of relief. I mean, it can be endless at times
Yes.
too. But like at least the way you said it was there is a way that taps into something else, just the kind of rhythm of life of make a meal, clean a meal. If that's all it was, then you wouldn't have that balance that you're saying, right? Yeah. Thanks, Rachel.
And I think, Karl, as you think about the beginning of life and caring for youngsters, and then to think about the end of life and caring for seniors who at one time perhaps were very productive and creative and really made this world what it is, good and bad. But then how seniors begin to lose their independence and they still wish to think clearly, but our brains age, and neurological things happen to us. So then we receive the care. And as this happens, we see amongst the people that we live with here in a retirement center how easy it is to love each other, to encourage each other in some way, though they may not be creative anymore, how they still need to be loved and cared for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, a lot. Yeah, like you said earlier with the chapters of life and that. And there is a way, there's certainly a critique in the philosophy of work or American work ethic that there's a certain kind of work that gives you value. And if when you're retired and you give up that kind of work, right, that there's a kind of question mark of what is my contribution? I'm not imposing on anybody, but I'm just saying, like, if all work is paid, productive work, then it takes a lot of meaning out of the other stages of life, right? So thanks, Joyce. Joy, I see you, but I can't hear you.
Okay, let's try this. Can you
There
hear
we
me now? Okay, great. I hearken back to historical perspective because I think history repeats itself, as we know. And I look at Catholicism and the saints, the women saints that we have seen. And I don't like the fact that toil is considered a negative connotation.
Right.
They never perceived it as negative. And I think if we revamp our minds to think of toil as something in a positive light, that's sort of my perspective. I've been a physician since 1986. Well, I graduated medical school in 86. There's lots to be said for toil, but also in a positive light, so I just don't like the negative flavor or tone of the word.
Yeah, it's a tricky, I wasn't sure what word to use. It seems to fit something of the experience, but you're right. It's not, it colors it in a way that seems so negative, right? But then there are Ecclesiastes that says, our joy is to toil. Um, like, don't make life more complicated than it is. It like learn to find some joy in that, right? So thank you for that, Joy. I think we have about one more minute. Well, I should know as a teacher, you never say that because nobody wants to make the last comment. But just another minute here before we close out.
Well, just another comment about our calling, as spiritually speaking. I felt called to be a nurse, and that lasted for 30 years. And while I was at North Park, I also cleaned houses and babysat that did not have much, what shall I say, respect or honor. But from nursing, then I went into hospital chaplaincy, and that had more honor that I felt that I deserved. And now in my retirement, I'm a volunteer at a mental wellness clinic, and no pay, but the most meaningful work I have ever done. And I mean, from cleaning houses and babysitting to picking strawberries, it's been a great, great trip.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Sally. That's a great note to finish on for now. Anyways, I'll put a few, I guess it's my job to give a couple book recommendations. I'll put a few book recommendations in the chat if you want to think about these things more. I'm sure you all have plenty yourselves that you could recommend. But thanks for being part of this. And Anthony, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Soderstrom, for your insights and for sharing that. Anything you're working on upcoming that you'd like to share with us? Any new exciting things you're doing?
Yeah, I don't know. I should have an answer for that right at like my elevator speech, but I don't know. you know, being a teacher is a great profession. So I don't know. I look forward to the semester that's ahead of me.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today, for leading us in our very first Compass Talk. And also, thank you to everyone that joined us and for your contributions and for your insights on this thing that, you know, we spend so much a significant portion of our lives doing, and so helpful for me to think through, you know, the whys behind it. So as we said, this is the first of our series of Compass Talks. Our next one will be Wednesday, February 19th, and we are welcoming Dr. Angeline Baladimas Bartolome. She's a professor of education here at North Park, and she's going to be sharing her experience with Yad Vashem Holocaust Studies program that she participated in. So Jasana is going to be dropping a link into the chat there. So that's to our link tree. You can go on there. You can register for the next talk, get all the information that you need for that. We certainly would love to have you join us for the next one. Hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. For those of us in Chicago and northern parts, please stay warm. For those of us in warmer areas, we are very jealous of you today. So thank you again. Thank you again, Dr. Soderstrom, for joining us. And again, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
There's two health bricks on.